Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all our viewers around the world. I'm Penny Pritzker, the chair of the board at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are thrilled to have you with us today for this special conversation for Pride Month, featuring two extraordinary leaders who have made notable contributions to furthering the LGBTQI rights in the United States and around the world. Former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton and Ford Foundation President Darren Walker. I am honored to introduce this important program and glad you could join us today. We at Carnegie are deeply committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As such, it's crucial that we continue to engage with LGBTQI rights as human rights and foster discussion with leaders such as Darren and Secretary Clinton as part of our work on these vital issues. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Dan Baer, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and former U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Secretary Pritzker, and thank you for all that you do and have done for Carnegie and as a public servant. Before we jump into the conversation today, I wanted to briefly put it in context because sometimes history, like life, happens so fast that we can forget where we were even 10 years ago. And of course, 10 years ago, Secretary Clinton was US Secretary of State, and I was fortunate enough to work for her as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Human Rights Bureau. Secretary Clinton has a reputation for working hard, and she works even harder than the public thinks she does. When she gave an important speech, it was something into which she invested hours of time, thought, writing, debate, and yes, heart. And that made it fun and fulfilling to work for her. This marks a decade since her landmark speech on the human rights of LGBTQI people delivered in Geneva. When we sent out invitations to the ambassadorial corps in Geneva, we didn't give away the topic. We just said it was a human rights speech. We knew that ambassadors from some countries might not attend if they knew what it was about. And we wanted them, especially them, to hear it. As was her wont, Secretary Clinton was personally invested in the weeks of preparation for that speech. And within a day of delivering it, it had over 1 million views on YouTube and had echoed in presidential palaces, foreign ministries, and justice ministries around the world. And I think 2 points are really important to remember. First, it was brave. The speech was considered a political risk. After all, the United States would not have marriage equality for 4 more years. LGBT rights were still a, quote, sensitive issue in foreign policy. Some were afraid to talk about it. Hillary Clinton's speech made the human rights of queer people something that world leaders had to talk about. The second is that the speech didn't happen in a vacuum. Secretary Clinton also repeatedly exercised personal diplomacy in her meetings with foreign ministers and presidents. She oversaw changes in the State Department's human rights reporting. She launched a fund to support civil society organizations on the front lines of these human rights battles around the world. And she instructed all her ambassadors to make this part of their human rights work, and so on and so on. And as we look around the world and our own country today, we have a new administration that is committed to the fight for human dignity, and we know that we have fights, new and old, abroad and here at home, left to win. So as we mark 10 years since her speech, it's worth thinking about the lessons we can learn from both political leaders and civil society about how change. If it's not passé to speak of America as having a national fabric, then Darren Walker is a beaded jewel in it. I've been witness to both public and private conversations where Mr. Walker's contributions are deathly serious, unflinchingly bold, and perhaps most impressively and unusually for this strange moment we're in, irrepressibly optimistic. And so there are no two better people to take stock of the hard work of progress and the hard work left to do. And it is a joy to have them with us this morning. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. It is indeed an honor to be here. I want to congratulate my friend Penny Pritzker and my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an institution the Ford Foundation has been proud to call a partner literally for decades. Today is a great day because we are celebrating something that many of us could never have imagined. We are celebrating the idea that we as gay, lesbian, trans, queer people, wherever we are on the planet, should have pride. Pride in the fact that we have a humanity that is recognized as legitimate and normal. This has been made possible because of the courageous, bold, visionary, and unflinching leadership of many people. When I think about my heroes and sheroes, Bayard Rustin, Audre Lorde, and so many others, I must also reflect on a woman called Hillary Rodham Clinton. For her continued and consistent commitment to the rights of LGBTQI people. As Dan just said, in that seminal speech a decade ago, she made it very clear that LGBTQI rights are indeed human rights. But let us not forget that she did something equally as bold 25 years ago at the Beijing Fourth Women's Conference, where she also uttered an idea that was radical to many, that women's rights are indeed human rights. So the through line on this woman, her commitment has been unwavering. And so, Secretary Clinton, it is indeed an honor for me to be here with you and have this opportunity to celebrate Pride Month. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Darren. And it's always a delight to be with you. And I echo both Penny and Dan in thanking you for your years of leadership and example on so many levels. So it's a delight to be here to celebrate Pride Month, but also to reach out to the Carnegie Endowment global audience, because as we all know, this moment of celebration isn't the end of the work that still lies ahead. And we need a lot of allies and colleagues literally around the world to keep doing the work that is important to keep pushing forward on equality.
Well, let's talk about that moment in Geneva and the run up to that, because many people said, Madam Secretary, now just isn't the right time. It's going to come, but maybe you might want to put this off for a bit.
Well, that's certainly what some said, Darren. My friend and former colleague, Dan Baer, knows very well that it was within the State Department, within the Obama administration, somewhat controversial to really stake our claim on behalf of the rights of the LGBTQ community at a time when there was so much else that was pressing in on our foreign policy and our national security. But I believed then, I believe more fiercely today, that human rights has to be a centerpiece of the work that we do as the United States, as individual Americans, and certainly as we're seeing with this new administration, as a real beacon for the rest of the world. By the time I gave that speech, I had, as you rightly point out, changed a number of policies within the department that discriminated against our LGBTQ colleagues, our foreign service and civil service officers, their families. So we were intent upon doing what we could within the confines of our bureaucracy to promote equality among all of our employees in the United States and around the world. But I also had some very disturbing encounters. I had to call the then president of Uganda to urge him not to sign a bill that was working its way through the Ugandan parliament that would have established the death penalty for being gay. And I had a very difficult conversation with him, someone I had known for a number of years, and in person, continuing that conversation at some time later, being told that there were no LGBTQ people in Uganda, that this was.
So literally, you're talking to him and you're saying, I'm hearing from LGBT people asking for help. And he's saying they don't exist?
There are none in our country. This is an invention of the West. These are imported ideas. This is a lifestyle that has been imposed on certain vulnerable people in our country, but it is not indigenous. It is not who we are. And I must say, although he was very explicit in his assessment, which he shared with me, he was not the only one. And in my conversations with other leaders in other parts of the country, I would raise the importance of human rights. I would be specific about the oppression of women, the oppression of religious minorities, the oppression of the LGBTQ community in their countries. I remember particularly a very heated argument that I got into with high-level officials in the Putin regime in Russia, in St. Petersburg, including the foreign secretary, the foreign minister.
Yes, you and that was quite a heated row. That was talk about that, because that was intense.
Well, it was, and it wasn't as simplistic as the denial by some that look, we don't have any LGBTQ people. It was basically like, we do not see that they deserve any kind of special protection. We do not believe they have any rights that deserve to be recognized within our society. And I remember saying, we are here in St. Petersburg. I have just been to the Hermitage. And you know what? You've had a lot of LGBT, very famous Russian artists going way back. And you're telling me that you're going to deny, you're going to undermine, you're going to, in a sense, marginalize, those today who are also part of this rich culture. It was a much more, it was a much more callous and cynical use. With some of these leaders, and I don't mean to make any excuse whatsoever for them, 10 years ago, there was still a lot of ignorance and a lot of denial. With the high Russian officials, this was a straight opportunistic political play to consolidate the more conservative factions of Russian society behind Putin's autocratic rule. So whether it was out of dangerous ignorance or dangerous cynicism, I kept running into this very scary and mean-spirited denial of the rights of LGBT people.
But don't you think part of the problem was that they were being called on the carpet by an American woman? I mean, gender had to play a role in this, because you were basically making the case to men.
Well, I think that's true, but I think it was more than that. I mean, Madeleine Albright once famously said that when asked, what was it like being a woman as Secretary of State, since, of course, she was our first, followed by Condi Rice. And she said, when you show up on that Air Force blue and white plane, you are seen as the United States. And so although I encountered some, silly and sometimes almost laughable instances of, sexist language or almost pandering, it was more because it was the United States. It was more okay, you're telling us how we're supposed to treat our own citizens. We know better than you. We either don't have them or they don't deserve the equality that you are advocating for, which is one of the reasons, as Dan Baer just said, we put a lot of emphasis on making sure that our embassies across the world would also be speaking up and speaking out. I as First Lady had marched in the, Pride Parade in New York City back in the day. Well, we encouraged ambassadors and other American officials in countries where they had Pride parades to, show up and demonstrate that, this was not just me speaking, but it was the United States position.
And you marched in pride parades when you were the New York State Senator.
I did.
I remember that.
Come on, Darren.
I remember those parades with you at the front. Of course. But let's really talk about the U.S. in that context as well, because while we've made great progress here, there are still many states where there are no protections for LGBTQ citizens against employment discrimination, housing discrimination, and other forms of discriminatory bias. So we've got work to do. Recently, even in Arkansas, your former home, the anti-trans legislation was so appalling that even the Republican governor rejected it.
Yeah. We still, unfortunately, can say that you can get, married on Saturday, evicted on Sunday, and fired on Monday. So, yes, we've made progress, but the lack of protections and the continuing discrimination, sometimes in very, physical, even violent ways, as well as legislation and regulation, is an ongoing threat to the LGBTQ community. And I think, Darren, that gay marriage shows how quickly, relatively quickly, an issue can be succeeded as an actual goal. And that is a great example, and one that I know we're all really grateful for. But we can't forget how difficult it is still across our country for so many people. Not everybody who has a friend, not everybody has a friendly environment at all, even an understanding. We still see children, young, teenagers being kicked out of their homes, becoming homeless, being abandoned, denounced by their families, by their churches, by their whole communities. So yeah, there is a lot of work still to be done.
Well, you and I over the years have talked about the role of philanthropy in all of this, and it's you really are sort of outlining the challenge for doing the kind of philanthropy to support social justice, and how difficult it is to continue to sustain that. Because unlike working on a philanthropic project around a vaccine, when science is really a series of discoveries that accrete and you never go back. And so you can always evaluate it and say, we're this much closer to a vaccine, to an antiretroviral, to whatever that may be. And you never go back. Everything is additive. What you're outlining is just how in democracies, especially, social advances can never be taken for granted. And I think that is, I'm reminded of that because, some 60 years ago, we were making grants to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, an organization you know well, for voting suppression, right? So
Yeah.
Voter suppression, they were suing the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia for voter suppression.
Right.
Well, our friend Cheryl Eiffel was right back at the Ford Foundation last year with a grant request to support lawyers who were going to be suing the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia for voter suppression. And so it's just an example, and certainly you know this, you started your career as a public interest lawyer. This
Yes.
is the challenge.
I'm so glad you made those series of points, and particularly the overarching reminder that social advances cannot be taken for granted. And we've seen deliberate efforts to turn the clock back in so many areas, including with respect to LGBTQ rights. The last administration, as we both know very well, was opening the door to a return to discrimination, to doing everything it could to undermine the rights of LGBTQ men and women to be able to adopt children, for example. And there were so many advances that we thought had proven themselves. And the voter suppression arena is a perfect one to point to, because if you don't link social advances to voting and create a constituency to preserve and protect those advances, then nothing is safe that has been achieved literally in the last, I'd say, 100 years. I mean, we're talking about everything from organizing unions for collective bargaining to working conditions, to women's rights, LGBTQ rights, voter rights, you name it, because the forces arrayed against progress that you and I would think is rooted in human dignity, human rights, are so powerful. They are financial, they are ideological, they are religious, they are partisan. And so part of the challenge in this moment is for people to say, well, I'm an advocate for gay rights, but I'm not involved in voting rights. To understand these are all linked. There is no safe harbor for people who are in the arena defending rights to turn away from all the ways these rights are interconnected. So, you really summed it up so well. We make progress, and then unless we really dig in and are so protective of it, and we create a constituency that will vote for people who protect it, it's always possible to be pushed back.
No, that's so true. But you are making the point that unless all of us are free, none of us are free. And I
Yes.
think as we celebrate Pride, I do believe it's important to acknowledge that, the movement for LGBT rights in the United States and globally has often been led from the margins. And this is true of social movements writ large.
Right.
But I think about the Black, Latinx, low-income trans, gay people who were the early adapters, the people who really took risks. And I think one of the concerns as a gay man living in New York City is that we in places like this live unfettered lives for the most part. And yet there exists within our community real inequality that you, of course, have talked about as a challenge for the larger society, but a microcosm of that absolutely exists. And we have to remember that just because those of us living on the coast are doing very well, generally speaking, in the United States, for example, we have HIV rates of infection and AIDS deaths that rival developing country statistics right here in the United States. And so it is important as we look globally, while some of us may be comfortable in global cities like London or New York, in most of the world, people are not experiencing our level of privilege. And therefore, we can't become intoxicated by our own success and comfort, and have to double down when it comes to pride and not just be smug and happy and haven't we achieved a lot? Yes, we have. But for so many others, that achievement has not manifest into real material improvement in their lives.
That is such an important point, Darren. And, when you were talking about being a gay man living an unfettered life in New York, of course, the first image that popped into my mind was Stonewall. I mean,
Exactly.
it didn't happen overnight. And it is important to understand that there are so many places in the world that have never had their Stonewall moment.
Exactly.
They've never had the kind of uprising solidarity that that moment represented. And from that moment, so much flowed. And yes, there were lots and lots of people and changes in the law and all kinds of advances, but there had to be that mobilizing moment. And right now around the world, since most people, gay or straight, do not live in cosmopolitan cities, they are spread throughout the world and smaller places, rural areas, as you know so well. There has not been the progress that I think we need to see. Advocates for LGBTQ rights are still going to prison in a number of places. They are still being denied the opportunity to have a job that they want to hold. So it is important to recognize that, going back to an original point, philanthropy has still a really significant role to play. It's one of the reasons why I started something called the Global Equality Fund.
Yeah, please talk about that.
Yeah, because government can do some things, and we certainly tried during the time I was there. But we needed a much more firm foundation to support the people on the front lines. The people who were standing up to leaders who denied their existence, who were showing up for pride parades, even though the police had been ordered to attack them. We needed something that could support both individuals and groups as they kept pushing for their Stonewall moment, their breakthrough, their being seen as equal in human rights and dignity. And so the Global Equality Fund, thanks to a lot of individual donors as well as organizations, began to try to intervene to support people, both before a crisis occurred, but also when one did, literally posting bail in some cases so that LGBTQ activists could get out of prison. So I think that when people wonder what they can do, clearly, as my great predecessor as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt says, human rights start in the small places close to home. How you treat one another, how you speak out for someone who is being discriminated against, how you stand up. And I love it when I speak to young people who themselves are straight, but who stand up to protect their gay friends in high school from being bullied.
Yes, our allies.
They're allies. And then they become, members of clubs for human rights. And so we need both gay activists and straight activists. We need people in every walk of life who believe in their hearts and then look for a way to manifest that through action in full equality. So the Global Equality Fund was one effort to try to find a place for people's private dollars to partner with government action to make a difference.
Because you understood from where you sat that the bringing together, the convergence of private capital, public support, and leadership that only comes from government, right? So the private sector cannot take the place of having that conversation. Yes, the private sector can have that conversation with the Ugandan president, but it holds a lot of sway if that conversation is coming from you. If you can follow that on with philanthropic capital that goes directly to support those local human rights defenders who are being thrown in jail or who have to bail people out, or to support organizations and some of those leaders, which I know the fund has done to get out because you're about to be arrested. I mean, these are the real life hardships that this fund has intervened in. But your point is well taken, because there are, depending on how you count, some 68, 70 countries in the world where to identify as gay is a crime. And depending on how you count, there are 8 or 10 where it is a crime for which one is executed. I mean, which is truly astounding when you consider that's 80 countries, basically.
Well, you're right. I mean, that is a sobering, terrifying set of numbers. And I hope that our audience around the world, if they didn't know that before, know it now, that sadly, there is shunning, there is abandonment, kicking people out of communities and families, but there's also legal consequences for identifying as gay in a way that becomes public. Now, contrary to my conversation with the still president of Uganda, most people recognize in these countries that they are living amongst, in their families, in their communities, people who are gay. They know that, but they don't have the leadership and they don't have the support to publicly acknowledge that. In some countries, it's kind of just accepted that, okay, as long as you don't speak out, as long as you don't in any way ask us to acknowledge your identity, we're fine. But if you want to be fully who you are, that's a bridge too far.
That's right. And that is not just, I mean, look here, as an African American gay man, growing up in a Black church, working at a Black church, you've been to a million Black churches. And as you well know, Black gay men, especially, and women, all over the Black church in this country.
Right.
But we were not acknowledged. And I will say the church that you used to visit with your husband frequently, Abyssinian Baptist Church, where I worked for your friend Calvin Butts for a decade, that was not a church where, and indeed, Adam Clayton Powell himself, the pastor of that church and the congressman from Harlem for 2 decades, was known to be anti-gay. And in fact, it is well documented that he was the person who threatened Dr. King, because Bayard Rustin, Dr. King's assistant, who was the architect of the '63 march, was himself a homosexual. And Adam Clayton Powell did not want him to be acknowledged or to have any visibility. And what's been wonderful for me as a part of the Abyssinian family is to return to the church, as I did a few years ago with David, my partner, and to have Reverend Butts say from the pulpit, look who's turned up this Sunday, Darren and David. How many Sundays have passed since we've seen Darren and David here, my beloveds? Now, for him to acknowledge me and David as a couple in front of the church family, as you know, was a very big deal.
Yes. And he did it. And as you say, he's a friend of mine, and he has gone on his own faith journey.
Exactly.
In so many respects. And that's one of the reasons why I hold him in such high esteem. I was at Cicely Tyson's, going home ceremony, her memorial service. And one of her closest friends was a gay man who was her fashion designer, who created those amazing looks that she wore into her 90s. And he was there with his husband, and it was like nothing. It was so normal. There was no moment of even awareness. It was just part of the fabric. So I think I do have an understanding, as I'm sure you do, of people of a different generation, even 2-3 generations ago, how they were indoctrinated, how they were taught. But let's fast forward. We still have many, many, many churches in this country who have not evolved, who are still standing there trying to act as though the reality is not in front of them. And they are forcing people who are in their choirs, who are their ushers, who are their assistant pastors, their Sunday school teachers in church to hide their identity. And we have whole denominations, white and Black, that are still extremely narrow-minded about what it means to be a child of God. So we can maybe look back and say, oh, well, 40, 50, 60 years ago, okay. But there's no excuse today. There is none whatsoever.
But there is hope, because when we look, not just here, but when we look globally, even one of the lessons of the U.S. experience has been that culture is a primary lever for progress. And you have to, one of the things that I think the early investors in the change around LGBT and marriage equality was that they understood that culture was a primary lever, and that culture was defined by and transmitted by culture carriers, and a primary carrier of the culture of a society are religious leaders.
Right.
And so engaging those leaders who are open-minded and who do see in their theology your place as a child of God, as a homosexual, that's an important thing to do wherever you are in the world. It is harder in some places, as you say. Obviously you just described. I mean, in Uganda under Museveni and the growth of all the evangelical churches from the U.S. I mean, are you surprised by what's happening in Africa around the resistance to change and the growth of that movement that is really, you want to talk about something that's been imported from America.
Right. Well, that's exactly what the irony was. Yes, I mean, the anti-gay equality forces, they're also anti-women and a lot of other things, in my view. They have been determined to, especially in Africa, but also parts of Asia, to send a message of exclusion, not inclusion. And, I'm a Methodist. We are basically splitting our denomination over the issue of LGBTQ rights, because there are churches that have really not only evolved, but embraced their LGBTQ parishioners who have, against church doctrine, performed gay marriages in the church, have been very, very loving. And then there is a very strong minority that absolutely rejects that. And therefore, rather than be fighting constantly, which is what the denomination has done now for many years, they want to leave. And so there's a process going on to try to midwife an exit for those who want to tell their pastors, you cannot perform a gay marriage, you cannot acknowledge any biblical interpretation that doesn't condemn homosexuality, etc. So churches are splitting. And one of the things that we've seen in this split is how focused the anti-gay churches and their leaders have been in creating allies in Africa, because the Methodist Church has a big presence in Africa, has set up universities and funded a lot of programs as well as churches. And so it's really been a global struggle, even within the United States, for churches like mine to be able to feel that they could move forward together. And in fact, after struggling for years, have concluded they can't. So those of us who have attended, churches that were originally called reconciling churches, and churches that have pastors who want to minister to all of their congregation, we're going one direction, but others are going a different direction. And they have a lot of allies among African parishioners and in some parts of Asia. So this struggle that we in the United States think, oh, okay, well, gay marriage, fine, we're done. Well, it was always clear, and appropriately so because of the First Amendment, that the government couldn't tell a church that it had to do anything. It couldn't say, okay, just because gay marriage is legal now, It's a civil right. It's not a religious right. Okay, that's the way we operate. But a lot of churches have just dug in their heels. The Southern Baptist Convention, they have been absolutely adamantly against women preaching, against forming gay marriages. So there's a saying in politics, Darren, that culture eats politics for breakfast. You can have the best politics, you can have the best political leaders, but if the culture doesn't permit the changes, it would have been impossible to get gay marriage much before we got it. But through a long and very thoughtful campaign, reaching out, making it clear to people, you know what? Why would you be against people loving each other? Why would you be against people having the right to marry? Aren't we for that? Slowly over time, enough people began going, oh, okay, I get it. I know, Jack and John and Susan and Mary, and oh yeah, I get it. So it took time, but we are still not where we need to be in this country, let alone anywhere else.
But we have to have messengers, leaders, and storytellers who speak from a position of grace and love and compassion. I think one of the most disturbing trends among leaders, and not just here in the US, and political discourse is the legitimizing of cruelty. That cruelty, meanness, mean-spiritedness, selfishness has been normalized as an appropriate, if one chooses, way to frame your own leadership.
Right.
And I think that is a fundamental challenge to the movement for all human rights that you fought for, but particularly LGBTQI.
I'm really glad you said that because, our President Biden, has said we're in a struggle between autocracy and democracy, and that is absolutely true. But we're also in a struggle between cruelty and kindness. We are in a struggle to overcome those who now feel emboldened to use rhetoric and exhibit behaviors that are not just distasteful, but dangerous. I know that our former president really gave permission to people. And if you think about our psyches, if you think about human evolution, I mean, part of our struggle has always been to try to overcome our baser instincts, to, try to get some sense of common goals and common human purpose that would bring people together. It didn't mean that, there still weren't doubts and internal implicit biases. That all existed. We know that. But we were moving in a direction where, it just wasn't acceptable any longer to be overtly racist and misogynistic and homophobic and all the rest. And then along comes a guy who is a walking id and basically says, you know what? If it feels good, do it. And there are good people. There are fine people on both sides marching through Charlottesville. And, those insurrectionists who tried to take over our capital, well, they're just, everyday Americans exercising their rights, and all the nonsense and dangerous, terrible rhetoric that we heard coming out of him. So people, and we have to also mention that, the internet has been a great gift. It has allowed us to communicate and connect literally around the world. But it's also posed particular dangers, peculiar ones we haven't seen before. Because somebody, griping and complaining about, Blacks and women and gays, getting jobs or getting married or doing whatever they didn't approve of, was kind of talking to himself. And now all of a sudden, there are whole communities that are purveyors of hate. And there are companies, as we know, sadly, too well, who harvest the profit from hate. So we are facing different challenges. There's always been, tribalism. There's always been exclusion. There's always been these human, unfortunate attitudes. But we were moving forward. And we had great leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who could embody what a different future looked like. And now we have a different kind of leadership. And it's a throwback leadership. We see it obviously in Putin. We see it in Hungary with Orban. We saw it with Trump, where there's a congealing of a kind of macho masculinity that has a political agenda, which has unfortunately been in the forefront. And people who support that, women and men, and we know gays who support it, people who step up and say, "Oh, I love that," and who vote for it again and again, and who kind of revel in the cruelty and find it almost exciting that people are being put down again. That is, we can label it tribalism or nationalism or fascism or authoritarianism, whatever we want to label it. But the leaders would not be leaders without legions of people who responded and supported that level of mean-spiritedness and cruelty and hatred that unfortunately we've seen too much of.
So, Secretary Clinton, we are going to bring this conversation to a close, but I know that in spite of the days when we could have easily these past few years been dejected, depressed, demoralized, despondent, you have always been an optimist. I know one of the reasons you're hopeful is because of those 3 beautiful grandchildren you walk around the park with.
Yes.
At least I've seen you walking around the park with them. What gives you hope, Hillary Rodham Clinton?
People give me hope, Darren. I mean, for every mean-spirited, nasty comment or action, there are countless others who have shown, especially during the last year of this pandemic, kindness and service and love. People are constantly surprising me for the good, by and large. People who also in their own hearts want to be part of a positive, hopeful, optimistic community, America, world. That doesn't mean we're naive. It doesn't mean that we don't see all of the challenges, but I choose optimism. And it's a choice every single day, isn't it? Because I know you do as well. When there are setbacks, whether they are public or personal, and when you lost your husband, I mean, those of us who knew you grieved for you, but you also had built something and created a life together that lives on. And I feel the same way about both my personal life, because I am blessed to have a wonderful family that I got to spend a lot of time with and see these 3 little grandchildren discover the world, but also because there's a lot of bravery in so many people right now, and finding that combination of courage and kindness coming to the forefront. Despite the efforts to paint them otherwise, the protests following George Floyd's killing were peaceful, and they were in solidarity, not just with one man who was murdered, but with all who are endangered and discriminated against, and all the lives that we've lost. And so I don't want us to lose that sense of possibility. I mean, 10 years ago, gay marriage wasn't a reality. Today, I have so many friends who are living their best lives because they are with their spouses. And so I feel like as much as we still have yet to do, let's take a moment and express some gratitude for all those many millions of small acts of kindness and courage that give us grounds for optimism and hope.
Thank you, Hillary Rodham Clinton, for giving us hope, for reminding us that public service is the highest and most noble of calling, and for dedicating your life to that public service, to the idea of the public, the idea of the public commons, the public square, and the public interest, and doing all that you could to ensure that everyone lives a life with dignity. Thank you, Secretary Clinton, for being with us, and thank you to the Carnegie Endowment.
Thank you all very, very much.